In fact, he dies basically penniless, and still nobody knows where he's buried, which is kind of funny. He's in the Dominican Republic, if he's in San Salvador, or if he's in buried in Spain. So it's I kind of find that humorous. Friday, and I'm going to send you a memo out, most likely this afternoon. Friday, I'm going to make an assignment that you review a DVD. You can get it through YouTube, and I'll give you all the instructions, and then I give you either 6 or 7 questions. They're very easy. All you have to do is watch the DVD, and you'll be able to answer everything. And it's for extra credit, credit that will be added into your final grade. I'm going to try to do 3 altogether. So I'll give you all the instructions sometime this afternoon or early evening until I get everything down. I have a new way of, the people in distant learning showed me a way on which I can take attendance, but it looks like that I'm still going to do both ways. The attendance it prints me out the name, what time you logged in, what time you logged off, how many minutes you stayed logged in. But I think that if you come into Canvas, it might not show up on the WEDX attendance report. So I'm going to have to do both. So that should alleviate me putting down that you weren't here when you actually were. So I'll try to straighten that out again. But we're getting close. Okay, so let's continue here. I think that we're going to start the War for Independence. We know that the First Continental Congress is acting as a central, a national, or federal government, and when we have the Intolerable Acts placed on the colonies, we know that the colonies met, and again, it's called the First Continental Congress, and they tried to come up with some methods to get back at Great Britain. Well, Massachusetts wanted to send a letter of condemnation, but they also suggested that each colony raise a militia. Well, it didn't go that far. It was considerably more moderate, as we know, and we know that the grievances and resolves was just the combination of Parliament. Again, Parliament. Parliament is their problem, and this is they have no bad feelings to say about the king. Parliament, not the king, and that's who they were very upset with.
Wait, Professor, are we still on Modular 2 or 3?
On the worksheet?
Yeah.
We should be down.
There's a 3, the start of 3?
Worksheet, no, we should be in worksheet 2. Matter of fact, there's not much left. There's work on worksheet 2 is Concord.
All right, so I'm looking at the worksheet where you're lecturing like on what number right now?
Oh. Actually, I'm going to be doing, we're at 26 right now.
Increase in slave population attributed to? Okay.
The intolerable acts.
No, number 6 on modular 2 is increase in slave population.
Is that what you have in the last thing? Well, we know that.
No, we were past. That's what I mean. We were past. My last note from the other day was intolerable acts number 26.
Right, that's what we are.
Oh, I thought you said 6.
Oh, no, 26, intolerable acts. And mostly intolerable acts, you know that there was 5, and the first 3 were enacted against Boston, Massachusetts, and then the last 2 was for basically the entire East Coast, well, half of the East Coast, Canada, and all that territory, especially New York, Pennsylvania, included anything on the Ohio Valley, Massachusetts, and I think the biggest thing about the last one, the Quebec Act, is that anybody who lives in this territory had to be a Catholic, and this is coming from a Protestant king. But we know, because of the Intolerable Acts, we know that this First Continental Congress fights the Intolerable Acts with another boycott. And the colonists are going to refuse to use any British goods. And we have an organization called the Daughters of Liberty, who then will start these home industries and basically make everything that the colonists need. This is out. So what happens here, they ban all the imports, but what's significant here is that they ban the import of slaves into the colonies. We know that the British had a monopoly in the slave import business. Even though there was no slaves in England, they had the monopoly of bringing slaves into the colonies. And this was going to hurt the English financially. It was not a moral issue. It was a financial issue, an economic issue, that they were going to hurt the British by not accepting slaves or denying them access to the ports with slaves. We know that the colonists, in order to get out the word to the rest of the colonies, they set up these committees of correspondence. And these were accounts of what was happening throughout the colonies in regards to the harsh treatment that the British imposed or inflicted upon the colonies, especially up in Massachusetts. You had these really bizarre reports coming out of Massachusetts that the women were being raped, or people were being bumped on the head, parts of children were being cut out and being eaten in the sea. It was so bizarre. But this is what was going on at that period of time against the British. Now, the war is about to start, and we're going to look at the start of the war for independence. Well, there were some in the colonies who felt that by putting enough economic pressure on Great Britain, it would prevent the crises from escalating. Because we know that the businesses in England, the merchants, the shippers, the financiers, they were trying to get Parliament to rescind these laws, to come to an agreement with the colonies as early as January of 1775. Now, William Pitt in the House of Lords and Edward Burke in the House of Commons already starting a process of reconciliation with the colonists. But developments were moving too fast in Massachusetts. And again, I make reference to that snowball that comes down the hill and gets bigger and bigger, and all of a sudden you just can't stop it. It's going to happen. So they were on the threshold of conflict. All right, there we go. Lexington and Concord. You know that General Thomas Gage, military governor of Massachusetts, began fortifying Boston in the fall, or as early as the fall of 1774. He asks for 20,000 more troops to come to Massachusetts. That's how things are getting out of the hand. He wants more troops. The colonists, on the other hand, were preparing militia. These small, organized, armed groups ready for quick action, and they were referred to as the Minutemen. So, as the word goes out, these Minutemen would then rise to the occasion. They would grab their guns, whatever they could get, and they would go out and face this well-organized, well-trained, well-equipped army, the British Army. You wonder, when we look at the beginning of the War for Independence, you wonder, how the hell did we ever win? I mean, how did we win this war? How did we get our independence? Well, there are reasons. And we'll look at it. Well, General Gage was ordered to arrest radical leaders and put down what he considered open rebellion in the colonies. So he's ordered to march out to Concord because that's where he believed the arsenal for the Minutemen was stored, and to capture anyone who was out there. Now, to warn of the impending movement of British troops, William Downes and Paul Revere then would ride out to the countryside and inform everyone that the British were coming. Well, I gotta look at that because that's another mistake in history. We know that the signal was that if the British were going to march out to Concord, they were either go by land, or if they were going to go across the Charles River and then proceed to Concord that way, they would put lanterns in the steeple of the Old North Church. So one if by land, two if by sea. Two lanterns meant that they were going by sea. So the word goes out. And Paul Revere and William Downes then ride out along the countryside, warning everybody that, like I said, the British are coming. Well, they didn't say that the British were coming because they were British themselves. So that's a mistake in history. Some historians say that they said the Federals were coming. But it sounds better the British are coming because as Americans, that sounds a lot better to us. So they ride out and they alert the militia. So on April 19th, colonials and British soldiers then would face off at a little town or little community in Lexington, Massachusetts. Well, the British then march. They're on their way to Connecticut, to Concord, and the Lexington militia now takes to the field. There must have been about 15 of them, and there's about 600, a little over 600 British troops, and you got about these 15 or 20 Minutemen standing there that are going to confront the British Army. So the British now, instead of just bypassing them, they make a line of soldiers and they face the Minutemen at Lexington. So what happens next? No one knows. No one knows to this day. But a shot was fired. And then the British then opened fire, and I think eight colonists or people from Lexington then bolted or killed. And it's referred to as the shot heard around the world. Because this is the shot that's going to start the war for independence. Well, the British then continue out to Concord. At Concord now, the word had gone out, and roughly about 2,000 of colonists, the militia, show up at Concord. So when the British get there, there's a skirmish takes place, but the British are outnumbered, and then they start marching back to Boston. Now, on the way back, the colonists, hiding behind trees and rocks and shrubs and everything, start picking off the British. They would run in, shoot, and then run back into the woods. And the British then go out trying to look for them, but they couldn't find them. In their march from Concord back to Boston, the British will lose 263 soldiers, either wounded or killed. 273. 273 will lose either wounded or killed on their way back to Boston. In the meantime, the rebellion quickly spreads. The British garrison in Boston was besieged. What happens here by the Green, and then also in Vermont, the Green Mountain Boys, led by Ethan Allen, will capture Fort Ticonderoga. Now, the Boston gets is under attack by the colonists. The cannons from Fort Ticonderoga are brought over to the Dorchester Heights, which overlook Boston, and it gives the colonists open. They can kind of bombard Boston anytime they want. Also, another battle that we changed the name of is the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775. The Boston militia, the Massachusetts militia, occupies. We call it the Battle of Bunker Hill, but they actually fortified the wrong hill. They were on Breed's Hill. But again, as Americans, we like this force. I mean, if you think about it, what sounds better, the Battle of Breed's Hill or the Battle of Bunker Hill? Bunker Hill sounds much better. So the British now come out of Boston, and the Americans are on Bunker Hill, are on the top of Bunker Hill, and the British then charge up the hill to Bunker Hill. They would repulse. They go up a second time, they repulse. And then the third time, when the colonists were about to spend all their ammunition, the British then will take the top of Bunker Hill. The engagement will cost the British about 1,000 men either killed or wounded. Big number. And then, in the meantime, what happens is that the guns that were brought over from Fort Ticonderoga now bombard Boston, especially the waterway because of the British shipping. But General Howe, who is in charge of the British forces in Massachusetts, decides that he is going to vacate Boston. he takes his troops now up to Halifax. And then eventually he's going to take his troops down to Long Island, where a lot of fighting will take place. Well, during this period of time, the Congress changes its name. It becomes the Second Continental Congress. The Second Continental Congress. So the war now, the war is started. It starts in Boston. And I need the other one. Here it is. It starts in Boston, and really there is no more real battles or time, a dramatic change in attitude towards George III transformed the American Revolution into the War for Independence. Again, we're taking a look at this. To the British, it's a revolution. To the Americans, it becomes a war for independence. And it's based on a principle. No taxation without representation. We want the same rights and privileges as any ordinary British subject, which the colonists felt that they were not getting. This is the road to independence. Also, we got to remember, like I said, this is not a social revolution. Things were good in the colonies, not a social revolution. It's not like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, where they overthrow the king or so on. All right, the first Continental Congress now is replaced by the Second Continental Congress. The outbreak of hostilities still did not mean the colonists were prepared to declare independence. The Second Continental Congress adopts what becomes known as the Olive Branch Petition. Olive Branch Petition. In this petition, they profess loyalty to the crown and appeal to George III to end the bloodshed. So outstanding issues between the colonies and Great Britain could be worked out. You know, come on, King, do something. Step in, tell Parliament. Let's work out our differences. They were still willing to work out the differences and still remain in the British Empire. Even the statement justifying the taking of arms rejected independence as a solution. So it underscored the colonists' commitment to fight for their rights. Not fight for independence, but fight for their rights. Olive Branch Petition. Nevertheless, circumstances dictated that Congress assumed governmental responsibilities. It's assuming the responsibilities for now conducting the war, conducting affairs in the colonies. Kind of like Congress today. They are going to be the government. You got to remember, too, there's a lot of limitations on this Second Continental Congress. There are things that they cannot do in conducting this war. Well, Congress sends a letter to Canada and asking for its support, or at least to remain neutral. Troops around Boston. Now, here's where the Continental Congress makes a brilliant decision. This is a brilliant mistake. They make the troops around Boston the Continental Army. Right? Primarily the Continental Army. Now, the brilliance here is that they will put George Washington in command of the Continental Army. Now, why is this important? Well, George Washington is a Virginian. He's a Virginian. And by placing a Virginian in charge of the Continental Army, which is made up mostly of New England militia, it is showing the rest of the colonies that they are united. It's showing England that they are united. It is showing other European nations, especially France, that they are united in their struggle against Great Britain. By the time the Second Continental Congress reopens in September, George III has rejected the Olive Branch Petition. And New England was proclaimed in a state of rebellion. Those New Englanders, they're rebellion. State of rebellion. In December, Parliament closes the colonies to all trade. They shut down the colonies. No imports, no exports. Well, who's that? Let's face it, who's that going for? For its part, the Congress created a navy and sounded out European nations, European powers on their position to the colonies. They send out ambassadors, envoys to these European countries to see how they felt about this new experiment in government. And another thing you got to remember is France, we know, and Spain, France especially, will aid will secretly give the colonies this aid as far as money and arms are concerned. The Spanish will follow also. And you got to remember, since not many nations in Europe like the British. I mean, the British were the most powerful nation in the world right now. And we have to understand that the British, their form of government was a constitutional monarchy, while all the other nations in Europe, except for the Netherlands, were monarchs, kings. Well, Russia, a czarina, a queen. So there was this hatred for the British, and so now this American Congress, the Second Continental Congress, they want sending out delegates to find out, hey, listen, want to help us? We could use the help. It's against the British. Now, that was the bottom line here. Oh, it's against the British, so you can help us. It was funny also too. It says that Congress had the power to create a navy. Well, I think it was only 6 ships. 6 ships. And actually, it's under John Adams' administration, who was the second president of the United States, that really developed a navy. Not during the Continental, not for the War of Independence. Matter of fact, we will rely on the navies of Spain and Dutch, and the French, to help us out, especially at the end of when the War of Independence comes to a conclusion. Well, George Washington now is Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He's basically made up of troops from Massachusetts. Let's take a look at the balance of power. I mean, think about this. You have 13 colonies. You have no real army. You have no real navy. And now you're going up against the most powerful nation in the world at this time. Now, at first glance, who do you think has the upper hand? All right, just think about it. Who would you put your money on if you were down in Atlantic City making a bet on who was going to win this war? Great Britain or the Americans? Because now we're the Americans. We're the Americans. Well, I think you could say Great Britain, right? Great Britain. Britain had a professional army, eventually putting more than 100,000 troops in the field, along with 30,000 German Hessian troops. These were paid troops, the Hessians, mercenaries. The troops were well armed, well supplied, they were well trained. And Britain could draw on a vast economic resources and had the largest navy in the world. Don't forget, Britain had a lot of colonies elsewhere that they could draw upon. They had colonies in the West Indies, they had colonies in Africa and India. So they could draw on these colonies also. But there were serious problems. Logistics. Supplying their force in the colonies and communicating effectively with commanders in the field across an ocean was difficult. Don't forget, it took about 4 to 5 weeks for a ship to sail from England over to the colonies. This is the supplies. Orders, what to do. Don't forget, the British Army is very disciplined. So they got orders, and they needed supplies. And this comes, I don't know, 3,000 or 6,000 miles away from the continent. There was another problem with Great Britain fighting this war. Don't forget, they had fought 4 wars before this war. 4 wars before this war, and they were still in debt for those wars. So now if they have to borrow more money and they have to tax the people of England more to pay for their adventures or their battles or their trying to take the American colonies back. So this becomes a problem. It sounds like Ronald Reagan, he invented Star Wars, and the Soviet Union didn't have the money to invest in a means of opposing the Star Wars. And what happens to the Soviet Union? It fell apart. Because they didn't have the money. But Reagan put all this money into in research, in the Star Wars, that basically, according to, after this all happened, actually said, well, this is impossible. This would have never taken place. But the Soviet Union did spend a lot of money trying to keep up with the Americans. And here's the same thing. Britain is putting a lot of money into trying to keep hold of the Americans, the colonies. So the debt. It was always an open question just how long the British would continue paying to keep the colonies in the empire. Too much money. Now, what about the Americans? What about the Americans? The balance of power. The Americans were fighting on their own soil, for their own liberties, and in short order for their independence now. All advantages. They had a cause. It wasn't like the British, where the soldiers were paid, or the Hessians were paid, these mercenaries. They're fighting for their liberty. Their independence. Washington, in spite of his limited military experience, proved to be an adequate leader. I mean, he wasn't no George Patton, but he was a good leader. Did a lot of retreats, but he was a good leader. Compromising his ability to lead more than 200,000 men. 200,000 men, not all at one time. I mean, there were points where his army was down to about 2,000 men, especially when they bivouacked over in Valley Forge. And one of the problems with the Continental Army is that most of them would fight when it wasn't harvest or planting time. They would sign up for 6 months, and then all of a sudden, at the end of 6 months, they had to go home to plant the crops, or they had to go home to harvest the crops. So this was a problem. Well, the American Army was poorly trained and undisciplined militia. When you would have the militia, say, come from Connecticut, or you come from New Jersey, and the head of the New Jersey militia was not necessarily someone who was trained in military warfare, but because he was voted on, because he had a lot of kind of influence, so he was voted as being the colonel or the captain or whatever from each militia. So as far as military genius is concerned, it was lacking. In addition, food, medicine, and ammunition were often in short supply because the Continental Army had no power to compel the colonies to provide what they needed. But the Continental Army, or the Second Continental Congress, would send a letter to New Jersey, and they would say, listen, we need 100 men, and we need $500. Well, New Jersey said, well, we can give you 10 men, and we can give you $50. And that was it. Because the Second Continental Congress did not have that power to force the colonies, the other colonies, to force all the colonies to provide for the war. So this becomes a problem. It did, nor did the colonies never filled it, like I said, they never filled their quotas or contributed to the war. So no. Perhaps the most serious handicap was the significant number of Americans who sided with the British. But in fact, when the war proceeds down to the southern colonies, like South Carolina and North Carolina, some historians believe it actually becomes a civil war because most of the fighting will be between those loyal to Great Britain and patriots. We're going to call them patriots. So this becomes a problem. Loyalists versus the patriots. Loyalists versus the patriots. Well, British sympathizers, here it is. Those who were sympathetic to the British were called the Loyalists or Tories. Loyalists or Tories. Matter of fact, most of them actually and those, okay, let's straighten this out first. And those who sided were loyal to the American side were called patriots or Whigs. Oh, sorry. I left the H out. Let's make this an H. Whigs. They're called Whigs. It was estimated that 20% of the Americans, and again, this was a good thing, unevenly distributed among the colonies were Whigs, loyal to Great Britain, wanted to remain with Great Britain. They really weren't all in one place, but we could say that there was probably more in the South than in the North. But we know that New York City would be the stronghold for loyalists, for the Tories. New York City basically becomes the capital. We know that the British Army will stay in New York City from the beginning after they capture New York City, right up until the end. About 1780, 1781, they will remain in New York City. It becomes the hot spot for the Whigs. Now, most of these loyalists include government officials whose positions and livelihood were tied to the empire. Merchants who were dependent on British trade. Like I said, New York City was a lot of merchants. And those who believed that a break with Great Britain would lead to instability and chaos. They felt that, well, we need the British to keep us in order. Among the last group were people who were actively opposed to the Stamp Act. Not want the Stamp Act. And signed the non-importation agreement, but felt that revolution was going too far. One of the notable, sympathizers to Great Britain was John Dickinson. He writes a letter called "The Letter from a Farmer in Pennsylvania," and in this letter, he actually says, let's not be too hasty here. John Dickinson is very interesting. He was a member of the delegation from Pennsylvania to the Second Continental Congress. And when we didn't get to it yet, but when they drafted and voted on the Declaration of Independence, he is the only one who did not sign the Declaration of Independence, which we'll look at in a few minutes. About the others who backed the English were the Native Americans. Native Americans. Don't forget, the British promised the Native Americans to keep the colonists on the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains with the proclamation line of 1763. So they were in favor of Great Britain because they knew that if Great Britain would lose and the colonists would win, or the Americans would win, that means more people would cross over the Appalachian Mountains into the Ohio River Valley and up into the Great Lakes. So they did not support the American war for independence. Mostly the Iroquois Nation, who supported Great Britain way back as early as the War of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. Another group that did not support the colonies or the Americans were the slaves. The slaves. They joined the British because they were promised their freedom. Escaped slaves served in the British Army, either as soldiers or laborers. The slaves also. So you have a lot of problems with the War of Independence with the Americans. Is we also had this internal struggle. Not only were we fighting the British, but we also are concerned with the Native Americans and the slaves. All right. Let's take a look at the War for Independence. Just look at this. Okay, the War for Independence. In January 1776, now the war is on. Don't forget, it starts in 1775. So now we're in 1776. Thomas Paine, who had come to America from England a year ago, here about a year, he publishes a pamphlet entitled Common Sense, which was a clear call for independence. Paine's theory was not corrupt politics, but the struggle between liberty and a monarch in the person of George III. He writes this pamphlet, and this pamphlet is assimilated out through the entire colonies. And it's an argument for breaking from England, not because of economically, but because England had a king, George III. The pamphlet was a huge success. More than 100,000 copies were quickly in circulation. It provided for the impetus needed for most Americans to favor independence. A strong argument for independence. Strong argument. In the months that followed its publication, the colonial legislatures were replaced with new state governments that approved a final break with Great Britain. Now, they shed their royal charters. And so they had charters. Now, they got rid of these charters, and they now are not called colonies anymore. They're now states. There are 13 individual states with 13 state constitutions. They are not the United States of America yet. They're independent. They're sovereign states, and each state governs themselves. Yeah, we had the Second Continental Congress, which was acting like a central government, but the states were still independent. They're not united yet. All right. What's next? What's next? Now the colonists, they have to tell the world why they are breaking from Great Britain. They need an argument. They need something to show everybody why they are breaking, why they're leaving the empire. So in June of 1776, a committee is appointed by the Continental Congress. Now it's called the Continental Congress, First Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress, now just Continental Congress. The Continental Congress took up the task of drafting a Declaration of Independence. Its members include Thomas Jefferson, and he becomes the principal author, as you will know. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. And it's called the Committee of Five. Committee of Five. Now, we all know John Adams, when the committee got together, they said, okay, you write it, John Adams. He said, no, I can't write it because no one really in Congress likes me, which was true. No one really liked John Adams. Benjamin Franklin was suffering from the gout, so he was in misery. Roger Sherman and Livingston had no real ability to write any type of document. And Thomas Jefferson, who was the most educated of them all, he had a flair for the pen, so that task of writing the Declaration of Independence fell upon Thomas Jefferson. Well, Jefferson finishes the Declaration of Independence and he submits it to Congress on July 2nd. July 2nd. It's discussed. They discussed Jefferson's document. They make significant changes to the document. I think they made 62 or 63 changes to the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson's attack on slavery and the slave trade was stricken from the Declaration of Independence on the insistence of Rutledge from South Carolina and Georgia. Rutledge. I can't remember his first name. John, but Rutledge from South Carolina. When Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he put in there that slavery should be abolished. Slavery should be abolished. And for one reason, when you actually look at it, when you say all men are created equally did not apply to blacks, the slaves. So Jefferson, after a debate going back and forth, they decide, okay, this will be stricken from the record. No mention about slavery. And another interesting thing about the Declaration of Independence, it is directed against the King of England. There is no mention of Parliament in the Declaration of Independence. We know that Parliament was the thorn in the side of the colonies, not the king. But here, matter of fact, when he writes this, he says the king is responsible for slavery in the colonies. that was also stricken, and it was made a little less of an argument. So slavery then is totally taken out of the Declaration of Independence. Matter of fact, when I'll get to it in a minute. So on July 4th, 1776, the delegates meet and they approve the Declaration of Independence. Now, one thing that John Dickinson did during this convention was that he made a proposal that it had to be unanimous. All 13 states had to approve the Declaration of Independence. Now he knew this because when it came time for Pennsylvania to vote, he was going to vote no. But fortunately, Pennsylvania had 3 delegates: Benjamin Franklin, James Wilson, and John Dickinson. So when it came to vote, Benjamin Franklin and James Wilson voted for, and John Dickinson voted against. So Pennsylvania carries a yay vote because it was 2 to 1. So the Declaration of Independence is now the document that's telling the world why the Americans are getting rid of Great Britain. Well, a copy of they made another copy of the Declaration of Independence. It was sent to the printer, Dunlap, and they were called Dunlap broadsides, and there was 150 of them printed. There are only I have to tell you. I got it right here. Up until 2000, there were 25 Dunlap broadsides known. Matter of fact, the French government owns one, the British government owns one, we own one, obviously, it's in the Smithsonian. Actually, it's in the archives, so you can go down to the building, you can actually see it, the one that's on display, but it's not the original. The one that Thomas Jefferson actually wrote is gone. Nobody knows where it is. It's lost from history. But you know that 150 of the Dunlap broadsides were printed. And we know that there are 20, in 2000 there were 20 of them, 25 of them that were known. They were private collectors, like I said, and some of the governments of the world owned one. Well, I have the paper, I have the print here, I don't know if you can see this, but in 2000, a guy, not far from where I live, on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, as a matter of fact, they can walk there. A guy, they had a garage sale. This one guy saw this picture. He liked the frame. It was a really nice frame. He didn't care for the picture. He paid $25 for the frame and the picture. And he was going to put his own picture in there, so he takes off the back, and lo and behold, there is a broadside, a Dunlap broadside, of May 26th. Well, here is the article. The last Dunlap print to be found was sold at auction for $8.14 million. $8.14 million in 2000. I kind of wonder where I was, because usually I ride up and down the Delaware. If I had come to that yard sale at the time, maybe I would have paid $25 and got the roadside done. But it's kind of interesting. Okay. Just to conclude, the Declaration of Independence is an itemized list of grievances against the misrule and abuse of George III. So you can go Parliament is not mentioned at all. Jefferson drew heavily on the political philosophies of the Enlightenment, particularly John Locke and his theory of the social contract. And this is what our entire government is built on today, the social contract. John Locke's contract theory of government. John Locke's main points were that people had rights, natural rights, the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Here's another thing, because when he first wrote it was life, liberty, and property. But they changed that to pursuit of happiness. And we all know what that means, right? And that governments are created to protect these rights. When a government whose authority stems from the consent of the people attempts to destroy these rights, the people can and should abolish that government. What he's saying here is that we have this social contract, and it's the right of the people. If a government is abusive, it's the right of the people to overthrow that government. I mean, we haven't overthrown any government. Who knows? Maybe in 2-3 weeks we will overthrow a government. But we'll see what happens there. But yeah, so it's based on John Locke and actually Rousseau and Hobbes also, some of their theories. Okay, we're going to end there. So either sometime